Lanyon Youth. Great to be with you by video again. So what would you stockpile in an apocalypse? Well, in my totally legit official survey of the Australian population, one thing was clear: toilet paper is essential. Wasn't it like totally unreal earlier this year, that whole toilet paper debacle that you surely saw in the news, where just like hurried people, and it wasn't just toilet paper, but hurried people came and stockpiled heaps of stuff from the shops. I don't know if you went to the shops and saw the shelves empty. Now, there's been enough mocking and laughing at people like this already, I think, and that's not my intention at all, actually, because so many of these people were kind of naturally operating out of fear, weren't they? It's like storing up and stockpiling for what they thought might have been the worst to come. This image of stockpiling or storing up stuff kind of helps us with our teaching tonight, actually. It's in part sort of what Jesus wants to talk about in this installment of Jesus on Life. So Jesus, the wisest of teachers, our rabbi, our teacher, he wants to offer us wisdom, as you might have saw in the Bible reading. He wants to offer us wisdom tonight on money, on wealth, on treasure. And so he launches into this topic by talking about treasure, and I'm going to read it again, and talking about storing up treasure. So just let me read these amazing wise words again, and then I'm going to give you guys a question, okay? Matthew 6, it'd be good to read along, wouldn't it? So Matthew 6, 19, I'll read to 21 for now. I'd love you to read along. Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moths and vermin destroy, and where thieves break in and steal. But store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where moths and vermin do not destroy, and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. So here's my question, or really questions, plural, for you. Just on that little bit we just read then again. In this passage, what does Jesus want us to do, and why does he want us to do it? So what does Jesus want us to do as his students, apprentices, disciples, and why does he want us to do it? Over to you guys.
These my dollars make it hurt.
So I hope that was a helpful conversation. Here's my take on it, okay? What does Jesus want us to do? Well, he wants us to store up treasure in heaven, not earth. But like, okay, what does that actually mean? What does it mean if we get to the bottom of it? Because it's kind of easy to imagine, I think, or easier at least, to imagine storing up treasures on earth. We've seen that, right? Stockpiling. But how do you actually like store up treasure in heaven? It kind of feels like a vague, kind of intangible concept. Well, think again, people stockpiling before COVID, right? What were these people doing? Well, they were operating out of this kind of anxious energy. They were kind of devoting and pouring in this energy into stockpiling for their kind of protection and safety. And they were stockpiling stuff they valued. It's kind of like a bird making a nest before spring, right? Like gathering everything together with all this energy. I reckon Jesus is calling us to use a similar energy, a similar devotion, but on heavenly things, the things of God. Not an anxious, fearful energy per se. Nevertheless, Jesus expects disciples or his students, his followers, to pour energy and devotion into heavenly things. In other words, Jesus expects us to treasure or value or to love God above all else. That's it, right? That's what it means to store up treasure in heaven. And I'll come back to this. My second question was, why does Jesus want us to do this? Well, obviously because God is God and we should worship him, but why else? Why does Jesus want us to do this? Well, firstly, it just makes sense. It's just wise. He's like, he says it in the passage. He's like, guys, earthly stuff, it rots and rusts away. It reminds me of a story that Sarah, my wife, tells me. If you've seen our car, you can see a big scrape on it. A story I often have to explain where it came from. But long story short, it's this big scratch with rust on it. And Sarah always says when she sees it, she's reminded of this passage. She's reminded that earthly things, this car she spent all this money on, will one day just disappear and rot away. Don't get caught up in it. I mean, just think about this, right? Like, so much stuff in our day, like, that we rely on, like the camera I'm recording this on now, the screen that you're watching it on, the bed you sleep in, your house, the clothes you wear, the screens you look at on your phone all the time. One day, that's literally going to turn to dust, to nothingness. I mean, the house you live in, your grandparents or even great-grandparents, their first home probably no longer exists. That's how quick it takes for earthly things to rot away and rust away. One day, all be gone, turn to dust. And so Jesus is just really like down to earth, wise. He's like, why focus so much on that kind of stuff that's going to pass away? Instead, he wants us to focus on something that will last, eternal, heavenly things, on God. He wants us to store up heavenly treasure because, verse 21, have a look, verse 21, for where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Now, we use heart to kind of refer to our emotions or feelings, like that's what we kind of use the word heart for, like we think of it to do with like loving someone and having emotions for them in my heart. Yes, Jesus does mean that by heart, but he means way more as well. The heart for Jesus is the center of the human being, your very core, okay? That's what heart means. It's like your central inner identity. Maybe the word soul works for you better. And it's what this whole sermon from Jesus has been about, right? Matthew 5 and 6 and 7 to come. It's all been about not just what you do, but who you are at your very core, who you are as a person. That's why it's so kind of confronting and penetrating for our hearts. So in this verse, when Jesus says, for where your treasure is, there your heart will be also, Jesus is basically saying, for where your treasure is, there your very being, there who you are is also. Or my kind of rough translation for you, which I think might help, is Jesus is kind of saying, whatever you love most, that is who you will become. Whatever you love most, that is who you will become. So where is your treasure stored up? Is it kind of on our fleeting earth or eternal heaven? Where is your heart? What do you devote yourself or pour energy into or love the most in life? I'll come back to that question because it's kind of where I'm going to end the sermon. First though, like honest question when I first read this passage, and maybe you had this too, what on earth was Jesus talking about with like the lamp and the eyes and the light? Do you remember that bit? I was so confused by it at first. Let me read it again. Matthew 6:22-23. I invite you, if you like, reading along. Matthew 6:22 and 23. The eye is the lamp of the body. If your eyes are healthy, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eyes are unhealthy, your whole body will be full of darkness. If then the light within you is darkness, how great is that darkness? Man, it feels a bit cryptic, a bit confusing at first, but not as much if we do a little bit of digging, which I've done, and I want you guys to do actually. So I'm going to pause the video here for a moment, and I have a little exercise for you, rather than a question per se. I've kind of outlined it for the leaders so they can help you. In your groups, get some people maybe on their phone or some other means to look up these Bible references, okay? Proverbs 28:22. and Deuteronomy 15:9. Proverbs 28:22, Deuteronomy 15:9. But listen to this, this is important. And maybe a leader can do it if you don't have a phone or something. But this is important. I want you to look up the translation, the ESV, instead of the NIV, which is the English Standard Version. I want you to look up that translation and have a look at the verses and the footnotes. And I just want you guys to have a chat and see if you notice any links to this stuff that Jesus is talking about with lamps and lights and eyes. Like, just see what you notice and see if you can draw any links. I hope the leaders can help you. Over to you guys.
These bandanas make it hurt.
So what was I hoping that you would notice in these passages? Well, firstly, you might have noticed that both passages refer to the topic of money or wealth, right? So instantly it's related to this teaching of Jesus for tonight. But secondly, you might have noticed that in both passages there's actually a reference to the eye. So in the Proverbs one, you might have noticed the footnote says that in Hebrew, stingy man literally means a man whose eye is evil. That's interesting. And then if you look at the Deuteronomy one that you looked at, it talked about your eye looking grudgingly to refer to greed. Now, it turns out, as we can see from these two examples, that actually this was a common idea in Jewish culture. The idea of an evil eye was actually associated with greed. So, if we go back to Jesus, for a Hebrew Jewish rabbi to start talking about eyes after he's just been talking about money actually makes sense. It's not random or deliberately vague and cryptic. He's just spoken about money, and so now he's bringing up the topic of greed with a common image of the eye in the Old Testament. He's saying, have eyes that are healthy or whole, not evil, not greedy. In our kind of lingo, we might say something like, don't have eyes that are overly focused on wealth. And then Jesus kind of finishes this idea with verse 24, our last verse. Have a look at verse 24. No one can serve two masters. Either you will hate the one and love the other, or you will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. You know, I reckon in all of Jesus' teaching, this is the only place another so-called God is actually mentioned. And it's the God of money. He says here, you can't serve the false God of money and our true God in heaven. Notice, Jesus doesn't actually command anything here though. He's just simply stating a fact. You cannot be devoted to two masters, to money and God. Imagine a person standing on the water with a foot in two different boats. Eventually, you're going to drift and drift. You can't have a foot in two boats for too long. You have to actually have your feet in one. It's kind of the same idea. Or think about it, you can't both be heading north and south on the parkway in Canberra. It's just impossible. It's just a fact. In the same way, a human can simply not have two masters. They can't serve God and money. Now, money itself is not bad. Often you'll hear people say stuff like, money is the root of all evil. Did you know though, when they say that, they're actually misquoting the Bible? Because Paul, he later says in the Bible that the love of money is the root of all evil. That is the love of money, not money itself. It's the same point that Jesus is making here. You cannot serve or be devoted to or love money and God. You can't both have them as number one. And then this brings us back to the kind of most crucial point of this talk. What or who do you love most? Because whatever you love most, that is who you will become. If you love money, if money is your number one, or wealth, you will prioritize work and getting a shift over kind of having rich relationships or going to church or attending youth. You'll prioritize brands and like new stuff over just being content with what you have. You'll become greedy, anxious, fearful, tense, and unhappy stockpiler, clinging to things that will rot the minute after you grasp them. Is that really the kind of person we want to be? Is that really a fulfilling life? I reckon storing up our treasures in heaven, I reckon being devoted to the eternal God who made everything is just far, far better way to live. To be like Christ, who gave up his treasures, who left his heavenly throne to take a cross and a crown of thorns for you and me. To be like that, to use our money and time and energy to help others. To be the person who gives away toilet paper in a pandemic instead of storing it up. This kind of person, and I've met them, that's the person I want to be. They have just a peace about them, don't they? They're, I don't know, just free, non-anxious, sharing, joyful, and generous. Isn't that a far better image of who you want to be, of the good life? Doesn't this Christ-like lifestyle just sound way better than the kind of view of the world? So let me ask you then to finish. Where is your treasure stored up? Where is your heart? What do you devote yourself, your energy to most? What do you love the most? For some of you, this talk is actually just like a small moment just to change some smaller things in your life. Perhaps you'll give something up just for a little while. Perhaps something you've just been devoting way too much energy to lately and you kind of realize it, and you might, just need a break. God's still your God, but this thing's just taken a little bit too much space in your life, and maybe a week off is in order. For some of you, this talk is a small but important moment to respond in that way. But I kind of feel prompted by the Spirit today to say this as well. For some of you, this might be actually quite a big, huge moment to respond. Perhaps some of you have noticed lately that you've been kind of drifting slowly away from God altogether. You've kind of been treasuring earthly things, friendships, school, stuff, money, pleasure, whatever. You've been treasuring these things above God himself. Perhaps they've become your God and you kind of know it. And perhaps you're even wondering if you're a Christian anymore. If you feel this right now as you listen to this talk, it's probably God prompting your heart. It's probably God speaking to you. God speaking to you through these words of Jesus and saying, really to all of us, it's time to turn back to God. The God you were made for, not these false earthly gods like money. It's time for all of us to love and serve and be devoted to our Master, to Jesus Christ, to our God again. The proper response as we think about this is, of course, as the usual, prayer. So at that, I'm going to hand it over to you guys to pray to God. And maybe some of you in that might want to return to him for the first time in a while.
These bandanas make it hurt.